Welcome to Fruit Snacks, a weekday podcast that covers big ideas about the Christian worldview in a bite-sized format. Hey everyone, in this next part of our study on the Trinity, we're going to focus on Jesus and how we can make the case that Jesus is divine and a full member of the Trinity and God, even though it is true that in the Bible, Jesus never explicitly says the words, "I am God." So what are we to do with this? Well, first of all, based on the Old Testament context that Jesus and his original audience were in and were from, Jesus laid out several very strong indicators that he was God, or that he was claiming to be God. He did things like claiming to forgive sin, like we mentioned in the last part about during the healing of the paralytic who was let down through the roof. Jesus claimed to be able to forgive this young man's sins, and someone in the audience said, only God can do that. And I think that was the point. We also see in the Gospels that Jesus claims to be one with the Father, making himself equal with the Father. That if you have seen me, you have seen the Father, he says to his disciples. Now, Jesus' favorite word or phrase to describe himself was the Son of Man, not the Son of God, as many people think. And the Son of Man is significant because it actually has roots in Daniel chapter 7. If you go and read Daniel chapter 7, what you find is that there is a person described as someone like the Son of Man who appears in the presence of God, the Ancient of Days. And unlike angelic beings or created beings, what you see with this Son of Man is that God, the Ancient of Days, gives to him an everlasting kingdom and authority, and basically hands him the keys to the kingdom, that the Son of Man, whoever he is, ends up becoming basically a co-regent over all of creation with the Ancient of Days, with God. Now, Jesus claimed to be this Son of Man, which obviously implies that he's claiming to be this being who is equal with the Ancient of Days, that essentially is God. Moreover, Jesus also claimed to be the angel of Yahweh from the Old Testament. We see in John's Gospel, just as one example, when Jesus says to those who are arresting him, "Who are you seeking?" And they say, "Well, Jesus of Nazareth." And he says to them, literally in the Greek, "Ego eimi," which is "I am." Now, this isn't the only time Jesus has said "I am." He says it to the crowds when he says, "Before Abraham was, I am," which again is a reference directly to Exodus chapter 3 and the angel of Yahweh, who is worshipped as God by Moses in that burning bush passage that we read about. So Jesus claimed to be this angel of Yahweh that throughout the Old Testament was equated in many instances with Yahweh himself. Jesus also claimed to be pre-existent before his life as Jesus. And I already mentioned that passage where he talks about before Abraham was, I am. And so when you put all these things together, it's very clear that Jesus is claiming to be more than just a regular run-of-the-mill human. And the religious leaders in Jesus' day clearly understood this as well, because when they arrested him and when they charged him and had him brought up on charges before Pilate, within the Jewish context, the charge was blasphemy because he had made himself equal with God. That was the charge. Now, they couldn't bring that charge to the Romans because the Romans didn't care. So they used civil unrest and treason, basically, as the charges that they brought him up before Pilate with. But within the Jewish context, it was blasphemy. Now, miracles aside, many people could have claimed to be and do all the things that Jesus did. And after all, in the ancient world, and even today, we believe that there are intelligent, evil spiritual beings that are able to perform certain signs and wonders as well. So what vindicated Jesus as God. He claimed to be God, but what vindicated that claim? Well, it was his resurrection from the dead. And so for Christians, just like Paul talks about, that really it all boils back down to the resurrection. If Jesus rose from the dead, then it vindicates all of his claims to be who he said that he was. But if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then he was at best a liar, and at worst he was a crazy person or some sort of charlatan. And so really it all boils down to the resurrection, which is where, when we're talking about Jesus and making the case for Jesus, we certainly need to understand all these points, that he didn't have to say, I am God, because he said it and did it in so many other ways. But it is his resurrection that vindicates that claim. Now, in our long-form episode, we'll dive into some of the errors historically about Jesus. And suffice it to say, they tend to err on one side or the other too much. For instance, certain errors about Jesus tend to overemphasize his divinity at the expense of his humanity, saying he wasn't actually or fully or really human, even if he seemed to be. On the other hand, there are errors about Jesus that overemphasize his humanity at the expense of his divinity, saying that he was not fully divine, or he became fully divine but was born a man, or something to that effect. And of course, we would say neither of those are the case, that Jesus is the self-existent second person of the Trinity in human form.